Okay, hello and welcome everybody. This is the second part of our series of the dual nature of the narratives of the first 11 chapters of Bereshit. We're here with Rabbi Dr. David Harbater. We got off to an electrifying start last week, and we cannot wait. We're on the edge of our seats. You set up the dichotomy. What does it mean? What is it about? And without any further ado, it's my pleasure to hand over Reb David, please.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, Vera Florence and your husband, who I can't see and I don't know his name, but welcome. And because you weren't here last week, it's going to be a little unfair what I'm doing. I'm going to give a very, very, very brief summary for you, Florence, who wasn't here last week, and I apologize to Vera for repeating certain things, but I'm going to do this very, very quickly. Okay? To be fair, for those who were, someone else wants to be admitted. And so last week we talked about that unlike the way this text, the stories of the creation, the story of creation is typically studied as one story of creation, what I tried to show, and I believe, or I hope convincingly, that there are in fact two stories of creation. And they are very, very different. When I say first, because chapter 1 of Genesis talks about a God who creates plants and animals before the human being. But in chapter 2, the human being is created before the plants and the animals. In chapter 1, the male and female are created together. In chapter 2, the man is created first, the woman is created afterwards. In chapter 1, the function of the man and the woman is to reproduce, to procreate in the world. The function of the man in chapter 2 is to work the land, and the woman's function is to do something in relation to him. In the Hebrew, it's ezel kenegdo, which is translated as some kind of helpmeet, a parallel, to answer some kind of existential need in the man. Very different functions in the world. The male, the human being in chapter 1 of Genesis and chapter 2. And finally, the nature of the human being. In chapter 1, he is created in the image of God. In chapter 2, he's dust of the earth. And chapter 1 introduces us to God, who's referred to as Elohim, which is translated as God, which is a very generic term. Whereas chapter 2 introduces us to Yud-Kei Vav-Kei Elohim, or the Lord God, and that is a different kind of God. It's the same God, presumably, but it's a different characteristic of God. And we talked about the fact that it's a very personal kind of relationship God, whereas the God of chapter 1 is a transcendent, sort of removed, who utters words and things come into being. And so that was just a summary in 2.5 minutes of what we did last week. Basically, to set up the fact that from A to Z, pretty much the entire, right, all the characters and all the assumptions of what the function of their characters is in the two stories is very, very different. They're very, very different to a great extent, competing with each other. And so that left us with a question. I think Rabbi Fishman put it in such a way, which I appreciate, and leaving you hanging, right? Because wow, now we have, I guess if you're hanging, it's because I was able to convince you that there are in fact two different creation stories. What does this all mean? What do we do with the fact that we have two creation stories? And that I didn't presume to answer last week. We didn't have enough time, but I will give you a layout, 3 different options, 3 different methods of addressing these two stories. One is the classic, I hope you're all with me. Again, there are 2 completely different stories that represent 2 different worldviews, different conceptions of the characters involved. And what do we make of the fact that we have 2 creation stories that are so different rather than 1? And so now here, I'm going to lay out what I believe are 3 different approaches. One approach, in a word, is reconciliation. When you have texts that contradict each other, then the goal of the commentary, parshanut, the biblical exegete, is to try to reconcile, to show that they're not really contradictory. I'll give you an example. I'll give you 2 examples, where the rabbis and Rashi, the medieval commentary, in turn, two examples. But let's talk about the vegetation and the creation of the human being. Remember in chapter 1, the vegetation was created on day 3 days before the human being was created, whereas in chapter 2, the human being was created first and then the vegetation. So there's a problem with the sequence. So the rabbis and Rashi in turn make the following argument. The vegetation started to grow, okay, on day 3, but it reached the tip of the ground. It didn't emerge from the ground. When did it emerge from the ground? Only after the human being was created. So here is an attempt to reconcile. Chapter 1 has the vegetation being created, but it didn't sprout forth above earth, above the ground, until the human being came forth and is created, and then it sprouted. Now, this is an attempt to reconcile contradictory texts, but it sounds to me, and probably to many of you, forced. I'll give you another attempt, which is even more fascinating and perhaps more troubling. The tension in the two stories between the creation of the man and the woman. In chapter 1, the man, according to the simple reading of the text, in chapter 1, the man and the woman were created together. In fact, the Hebrew terminology is zachar u'nekeva, male and female. And we explained why it makes sense. Why, if their function in life is procreation, then it makes sense that they'll be created male and female. Oh, but then you look at chapter 2, and what does chapter 2 do? Chapter 2 says that the man was created first, and the woman was created afterwards from his rib. So these two versions of the story seem to completely contradict one another. What do? So the rabbis, and again, Rashi presents this in his commentary, and he says, how do we resolve this tension? That in fact they were created together, but they were created as one being. And then when it came at a certain point, God decided to, right, they were a two-headed creature, that there was one body with two heads, male and female heads. And then at a certain point, God cut them in half. Hence, at that point, there was a male and a female. So text chapter 1 that describes them being created together, right? It was in fact one body with two heads. And in chapter 2, when it says that woman was created from the man, it's the act of God separating the woman, literally cutting into two and dividing, and now we have a separate woman. So this is an attempt to overcome the contradiction between these two versions. Now, again, I can't imagine that any of you find this explanation convincing. Because I think that zachar and nekeva, when it says male and female, presumably that male and female is, and that's the language the Torah uses. By the way, the language of male and female, zachar and nekeva, appears here and appears in the flood story. And it says the animals that were brought on the boat, on the ark, were brought zachar and nekeva. Does anyone suggest that animals were two-headed creatures? Right? In other words, zachar and nekeva, male and female, throughout the Torah means male and female in the very conventional sense of the word. So to suggest that male and female means they were a two-headed creature is very bizarre. And also the fact that the idea of cutting is not exactly true. The Torah doesn't say that God cut them in half. The Torah says that God took his rib and created her from that. Nothing here seems to be the natural reading of the text. But here's the thing. But there are other attempts at reconciling the various contradictions. These are just two examples. Now, what is the underlying premise in this approach? And it sounds almost silly. Again, I'm speaking for myself. Maybe I see Vera with this frown on her face. So I'm getting a sense that Vera's also I can't see Terry's face. I can't see Florence's face. I can't see Shuchat's face, but I can see Vera's face, and I am sensing a little bit of, I don't know, cynicism, whatever it is. And if maybe I'm projecting, but certainly I feel that these explanations are forced and really don't work well with the text. But why would the rabbis, and why would Rashi, great thinkers, great minds, come across with this approach? And here is the thing: there's a very, very deep theological premise lying behind these efforts. And it's very simple. When we speak, when human beings interact with one another, and in our conversations, if we contradict ourselves, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Now, you're all saying it's a bad thing. Human beings, if I say something now and 2 minutes later I said something that contradicts himself, then you would challenge me. Then I would look foolish, and it would be right of you to point it out. David, you said X, and now you're saying Y, and you need to make sense. You need to be coherent. You need to be consistent, and that is a reasonable assumption. So if we expect human beings to speak in one coherent voice, all the more so we would expect God to speak in a one coherent, consistent voice. And so if there are contradictions between one biblical text and the other, then in deference to God, we have to. It is our duty to find a ways to reconcile so that God is a coherent being, that God's speech, God's words make sense, they're consistent, they're coherent. And that is I would even say, for most of the history of biblical commentary, was always the underlying approach. Namely, whenever there's a contradiction, it is our duty to resolve the contradiction so that God speaks in one voice, and so that we can understand there's a consistent, clear message. And so when the rabbis and Rashi offer this approach, it isn't just to play a game. It is an attempt to defend God's honor. How do you defend God's honor? That when God's word, namely the Torah, contradicts itself, it is our duty to defend God's honor. How? By reconciling contradictory texts. And this is the way classic commentary, classic Parshanut has worked for hundreds, if not thousands of years. However, in the late 18th century, early 19th century, it began in Germany and spread elsewhere. A new approach emerged in the world of biblical studies. And that approach, it was founded largely by a German scholar named Julius Wellhausen, who is considered the forefather of a new approach to biblical scholarship. And that approach, and he developed a theory that became known as the documentary hypothesis. The documentary hypothesis. And what it claims is the following. Do you want to know why there are contradictions between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2? Do you want to know why there are contradictions throughout the Torah, which obviously we don't have time to get into now, but there are contradictions all over the Torah, inconsistencies and contradictions all throughout the Torah. Do you want to know why, says Wellhausen? Because unlike traditional faith, which claims that the Bible, the Torah, is the word of God, dictated to Moses and transmitted for over thousands of years to the people, wrong. Right? Using the tools of modern scholarship and modern skepticism and careful reading of the text, they did away with the traditional assumption that this is a divine text written by God, but rather he put forth the theory or the hypothesis that the Torah was not written or dictated by God at all. It's a book that was comprised of 4 different authors or sources, i.e. authors. 4 different people, right, had a hand in the text that we finally have today that was redacted. Namely, there are 4 different people or schools that each given expression in the book that became called the Torah, and they are called, in the traditional world of documentary hypothesis, 4 voices were identified, or 4 sources were identified: J, E, P, and D. And I don't want to go into all the details, but J in a nutshell refers to the God's name. J is German, Yahweh. It's the Y in German is, J in German is Y. So it became, that's one school. P is the priestly school, E is the Elohist school, and D is the Deuteronomic school. I don't want to go into all the detail. But what Wellhausen did, and his followers, and pretty much all successive Bible scholarship has bought into, to one degree or another, that the Torah is not the way religion has imparted, right? The text that we have is not to be understood the way religious tradition has taught us, namely that this is the work of God, but rather it is the work of human beings who contributed their own sources, their own traditions, and ultimately compiled or edited in a book later called the Torah, which is a collection of 4 separate documents. So when we see a contradiction between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 in the creation story, there's a very simple solution. It is to attribute them to different authors. So Genesis chapter 1 in the world of the documentary hypothesis, it's called the critical reading of the Bible. The critical theory is that chapter 1 of Genesis is attributed to P, the priestly worldview. Don't ask me why at this moment. It's something I discuss at length in my book. And chapter 2 is attributed to J. Now, put simply, right, J refers to God's name. As we already said, God's personal name appears in chapter 2. It does not appear in chapter 1. But there's more to it than what I just said. So in other words, if I have to summarize the 2 different approaches that we've seen so far, the first one insists on reconciling contradictory texts. And that is the traditional approach. It is acknowledging that the Torah contradicts itself in many places, and it tries to overcome the problem by saying that, by kind of with some very creative, I would sometimes refer to it as intellectual gymnastics. Play this little game. Again, it sounds like a game, but it really has a deep theological underpinnings. Namely, God doesn't contradict himself, and when it appears that it does, then we have to reconcile contradictories, that God speaks in one voice. Then the Bible critics, starting from the late 18th century, it became much more developed in the 19th and the 20th centuries, and it has various permutations in the scholarly world in terms of this particular thesis has been debated, and there are other theories out there, but the general principle is that this book is not a divine book at all. It's a collection of documents written by human beings at different times in history. So if you have, to the second approach to resolving contradiction between these 2 stories is to say, well, they were written by different people. What do you want? Obviously, if J has his own worldview and P has his own worldview, then they're going to present their worldview in very different ways. Hence, there's not only is no point in reconciling contradictory texts, it's silly. It's a waste of time because there are different authors. There are different authors that respect different worldviews, and therefore it shouldn't be at all surprising that they speak in different languages and put forth different theories and different conceptions of God and the human being, etc., etc. And therefore, we have solved the problem. Text Genesis 1 is P, Genesis chapter 2 is J, end of conversation. Those are 2 approaches. And I want to suggest the third, and I'm not the first person to suggest the third. I'm largely based on, it was alluded to in Rabbi Soloveitchik's work, The Lonely Man of Faith. I don't have time to show you. And it was elaborated in more detail in the work of Rabbi Mordechai Breuer, an Israeli-based rabbi/scholar, who I studied with personally. And he was an Israeli-based scholar, lived, I don't know, more or less the same time as Rav Soloveitchik. He was like 20 years younger. And he made the following claim. And again, Rabbi Soloveitchik adopts the same approach to some extent. And what is the basic claim? It goes the following. Everything the Bible critics say is right. Everything. Namely, that the Torah reflects contradicting worldviews. So when you see contradictions, don't try to reconcile them artificially, because they're real. The contradictions are real. And so forcing, right, imposing upon the text a reading that isn't there is artificial, and it's in fact undermining what the text. The text is written in ways that contradict itself, right, intentionally. But here's the catch. here, Rabbi Mordechai Breuer accepts really the identification of the different sources. The only difference, and this is a critical difference between Rabbi Mordechai Breuer and the Bible critics. So in this respect, he agrees with the Bible critics. Their ability to detect or identify the various voices, he accepts wholeheartedly. The difference is, he says, that if Bible critics attribute the contradictions to different sources, i.e. authors, Rabbi Mordechai Breuer says, I attribute those different voices, those different sources, to the different voices of God. I'm going to say it again. What the Bible critics attribute to different authors / sources, or different sources that reflect, right, the different authors who wrote at different times with different agendas, Rabbi Mordechai Breuer came along and said, everything you're saying is right, except for your conclusion. You're right in reading the text the way you are, because the text contradicts itself right and left. But rather than conclude from this that the Torah must have been written by different authors, God spoke in different voices, sometimes contradictory voices. Because, and here's the catch, we think that and this Rabbi Mordechai Breuer actually says this, we think that we're making God look good by imposing our human assumptions about dialogue, about conversation, about consistency. So by applying that to God, we think we're doing God a favor. We're making God look good by reconciling contradictory texts. What we're basically doing is saying, since we in the human realm have to speak consistently in one voice, when the Torah, or i.e. God's Torah, speaks in multiple voices, in contradictory voices, it's our duty, most people think, to reconcile those contradictories so God looks intelligent. So that's an attempt to impose a human reading of the Torah on the Torah. And Mordechai Breuer says, why would you do that? Why would you? What you're doing is you think you're elevating God. You're not. You're reducing God. You're belittling God because you're interpreting his Torah through the human lens of consistency. But the Torah was written in a way by God intentionally, in a way that reflects complexity and multiple voices and contradiction, because God is a complex being. God is allowed to contradict himself. He's not human. And so trying to impose consistency on God is trying to impose a human reading onto God that isn't God. It's belittling God. Just when you think you're upholding the dignity of God, Rabbi Mordechai says you're doing the opposite. You're reducing God and reading his Torah in a human way. But the contradictions are real and they're meant to be embraced rather than rejected, rather than reconciled. And I'm going to give you a few examples to illustrate this point, which you're all familiar with. If you went to shul, to synagogue, on the high holidays, then you probably, even not on the high holidays, we said on some other times as well, on fast days, but particularly on the high holidays, we have a prayer that goes like this. You all know it, because Barbara Streisand made a song about it. Avinu Malkeinu. Now, that's only the first two words. And then there's a series of phrases that start with Avinu Malkeinu and continue. There's a long prayer with a long series of Avinu Malkeinus. Let's translate. Avinu, my father. Malkeinu, our father. Malkeinu, our king. And then we continue and utter his praises, right? Or beseech God to answer our needs. Avinu Malkeinu. Let's analyze those two words. Let's think about a father. What associations do we have with a father? Well, he's kind. He's caring. He's forgiving. He's compassionate. Unconditionally loving his children. That's the association we have with a father. When we think of a king, we think of judgment, rule of law. We think of strictness. We think of, right, enforcement of law. We think of rigid. We think of rule, punishment, etc. We think of distance. These two descriptions of God are utterly contradictory. To say that God is our Father is to portray God in one way, and to portray God as Malkeinu is to portray God in a completely different way. And yet, what flows from our tongue naturally throughout the Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur prayer, Avinu Malkeinu, as if those two things are consistent. They are not consistent. They are not. Our Father is our Father. Our King is our King. We do not relate to fathers and kings in the same way. Yet, the text, the tefillah, the prayer that we utter throughout the Rosh Hashanah Kippur is saying that they are both true about God. In other words, the message here is that God is a complex figure, that Judaism is complex, that religion is, that human beings are complex, that our relationship is complex, multifaceted, multidimensional, multivocal. That's the God that we have. So Rabbi Mordechai Breuer is saying that biblical criticism or the documentary hypothesis did a great service to the comment to biblical commentary, because it introduced the possibility that contradictions do not need to be resolved. But instead, and this is why Mordechai Breuer parts ways from biblical criticism, contradictions don't need to be resolved, and they don't need to be attributed to different authors. Contradictions need to be embraced, because life is filled with contradictions. And so from the very opening chapters of the Torah is introducing us to a plurality of worldviews, not because one is right and one is wrong, because they are both right. They are both true, even though they are very different and to a great extent contradictory. The Torah and God and God's vision of humanity is complex and multifaceted. Hence, we have answered the puzzle. What is the Torah trying to convey? It's trying to convey from the very opening chapters the idea of the complexity of the religion that we call today Judaism. It's not one voice, it's multiple voices. And we have to learn to live with the contradictions. That is the third approach, and the one that I find most compelling and most meaningful, because to me it enriches our Jewish life in ways that most people live as kind of a bifurcated existence. Religion is either one, or God is either this or that. Human beings are either this or that. And the point the Torah is trying to convey, again, if you adopt this approach, is understand that complexity is built into the fabric of the system that we call the Torah. Any questions before I move on? Yes, Vera.
Comment. I mean, when you say Avinu Malkeinu, you see a contradiction. I see that what we're trying to describe is that our God is, or our King is godly. So, he's not that distant guy. He's not that definition of king. He looks more like a father. So they go together. They don't contradict. But when you say that the man comes after the vegetation or before the vegetation, it's a fact. So which fact is real? And when we want to believe in the Torah, we want to believe that it is the truth. Therefore, there's no lies or no contradictions. Contradictions are facts, not our unthinking what's an interpretation of the word. So I'm still confused on
Vera, I appreciate your question, and I'll give you my answer. And I'm going to say that many people understand the Torah as teaching us facts about the world. I don't. I think the Torah is not a book of science that's trying to tell us how the world was actually formed, but it's trying to convey ideas about the world. Now, it's true that the Torah uses the language as if these things occurred literally, right? Like the talking snake. But I, for one, say that the Torah is not interested in conveying facts, it's interested in conveying ideas. It's a book of theology, not a book of science. And therefore, what you describe as fact is less important, to me at least, than the ideas the Torah is trying to convey. So the distinction you try to make between Avinu Malkeinu and the order, the sequence of the plant vegetation, to me is less of an issue, because I don't start with the premise that the Torah is trying to give a scientific fact. It's trying to convey that there are different ways of that the plant. Okay, I think you get where I'm going with it. It was a very good question, though. I appreciate the question. Okay, if there are no other questions, I want to continue. And so I've explained the general, right, the logic, I say the theological meaning behind this, multifaceted, complex document called the Torah. But now we need to flesh it out a bit more. So now we need to now we accept the fact that the Torah is offering different perspectives that contradict each other in many ways, and they're all true. So if we open up to Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2 again, I want to go back and look at chapter 1 and see what is the fundamental difference between, I'm going to focus our attention because obviously our time is very limited. But if we look at chapter 1, just glance through chapter 1. Again, I don't know if S. Shuchat and Terry and Florence have text in front of you, but one of the things that I asked in our first class is that you have access to the book of Genesis in Hebrew or in English, or preferably both. Hi, Terry. So just if you take a look at chapter 1 and just skim it for a moment, I'm going to ask you the following question. And it's really a simple question. In chapter 1, and literally from chapter 1 of Genesis until the beginning of chapter 2, the first 3 verses of chapter 2, that's part of the same story. If you skim it, I would ask you the following question. Who is the primary character? Just take a minute or two, speed through chapter 1 until chapter 2, verse 3, and tell me who was the primary character of this story.
But it's God.
100%. How do you know that? I can't hear you, viewer. You're on mute.
Sorry, because God says, and He says.
God says it. And almost every paragraph starts with Vayomer Elohim, right? Every paragraph starts with, and God said. Okay, it's all about God. And even when God creates human beings, it's because God said. And then God said, He utters words and things happen. So it's a theocentric, theo meaning God. It's a theocentric description of the world, right? It's all about what God did. Even the human beings are only listed in a few verses, even though they're the sort of the apex of creation. They are apex of creation because God created him in this way. So God is without a doubt, is the primary character in chapter 1. It's the story of it's a very much a theocentric, right, presentation of creation. But if you look at chapter 2, okay, and let's say just read chapter 2 until the end, who's the focus of attention? From chapter 2, verse 4.
Well, I guess not human beings, right? Adam and Eve and the story.
It's God of course God is a character here, but very much right focused on human beings, right? He looks down below and he creates the human, he forms the human being. We're going to see in a moment, he places the human being in this garden. He waters the garden, he provides him trees, he provides him animals, he cares about his loneliness. So of course it's God, but the focus is on the human beings who occupy the world, the created world. Or I would call it in fancy terminology, it's anthropocentric. It's an anthropocentric, meaning it's a human-centered description of the world. So one thing is clear, that in chapter 1, or the P version of creation, is one that focuses on God, and the J, right, what's attributed to J, like J source or J voice of God, if you accept Rabbi Breuer, right, is focusing on the creation story from the perspective of the human being. So let's go back to chapter 1. So if chapter 1's focus is on God, what do we learn about God from the creation story? What features do we learn about God from the creation story according to chapter 1? Help me out here. Like if you had to say some adjectives, what emerges from chapter 1 about God? What are his characteristics based on the story itself?
Well, the feature of creation. I mean, he's a creator.
Oh, he's a creator, 100%. What else? He's a creator. That's obvious. But what else?
He likes what he's doing.
He what?
He likes what he's doing.
He likes what he's doing. Excellent, excellent, Terry. Because if you notice at the end of days, he looks back at his creation and he says, it's good. What else? He admires his own work. What else? Let me ask you the following question. Does God have a design? Does God have a plan when he creates the world?
Yes.
It's well thought out. If you ask me what's the primary characteristic of the world that God created, it's order, it's structure, it's divisions, right? It is like God divided the water from above and the water were roaring. He divided the water from the earth. He separated separation, divisions. God is a very well organized character. He's very well thought out. He's very well organized. Or if I had to put it in a different terminology, I would say that creation is almost like an architect. God is like the architect who had a wonderful design for the world. And then when he actually created this world like an architect, what did he do after looking on his creation? He looked back and he said, Tov. He said, it's good. Or the way I would translate the word Tov is perfect. In other words, this is a God who has a thought out, structured plan based on order and purpose. And at the end of creation, looks back and said, well done, pat on the back. In other words, he has a plan and he executes his plan to perfection. That's what the text is telling us about God. He's a well-oiled machine who knows exactly what he's doing. And then when it's all done, he says, I did it, proud of myself, created the kind of world I wanted. No mistakes, no fundamental flaws. It's all the way it should be. Now, if you just glance for a moment at chapter 2, does God create a world where everything is perfect the way he planned, so to speak? Give me an example of something that didn't exactly work out the way he expected in chapter 2. We talked about it last week.
Cain and Abel, I guess.
No, that's chapter 4, not Cain and Abel. Chapter 2.
True.
What did God realize after he created? What?
Loneliness?
Correct.
Loneliness.
You didn't know he was lonely before? You didn't know. You couldn't have figured this out. He was going to be lonely. But beyond that, when God realized he was lonely, what did he then do? We talked about this last week. What did he do? What was the first thing he did after he realized that the human being was lonely? This is
made him
create what?
Creates a female.
No.
Animals.
For those who weren't here last week, might be surprising. For those who were here last week, God realized the human being is lonely. And then, shockingly, God creates animals thinking that would somehow resolve his loneliness, only to realize it didn't work. So think about the gods of chapter 1 and chapter 2. The God of chapter 1 has a perfectly planned, designed world. Everything works out exactly. He knows what he's doing from beginning to end. And when it's all said and done, he looks back and said, this is perfect. Hine tov me'od. It's very good. Or again, it means it's absolutely perfect. In chapter 2, the God that we hear about, who creates not from above, but creates from below. He blows breath into the human being, and the human being emerges, right? Sort of because God cares for him. And then God realizes along the way there's certain things that that he realized now that he didn't realize before. It's a different kind of a God. It's a God that seems to not know everything in advance. It's a God that seems to learn from trial and error, right? The fact is that he created human animals for the human being, realizing that didn't work out. But the God of chapter 1 would never have made these mistakes. This God of chapter 1 is a perfect being who creates a perfect world. Do you understand the difference? Okay, so we have here chapter 1 is a very deliberate God who knows exactly what he's doing. I'm going to show you something fancy, even in the words, that this is reinforced even in the words of the text, which you might find fascinating. Most people don't notice this. I wasn't the first one to notice it, but it's fascinating, right? If you read the Hebrew, how many words are in the first verse of text 1 of chapter 1? How many words are there look at the Hebrew, if you have the Hebrew text, how many words are there in the first verse of the Torah?
7.
And how many times is the word, how many words are in the second verse of the Torah?
2, 3, 4, 7, 8. My other one.
How many?
18.
Nope.
I-
14.
Oh.
There are 14 words in the second verse of the Torah. How many times does the word tov appear? Okay, I'll tell you, it appears 7 times. How many times does the word earth, eretz, appear? I'm not going to make you do this because we're limited in time. The word eretz, land or earth, appears 21 times. The name Elohim, you can check me on this afterward. God's name Elohim in the first creation story appears 35 times. All multiples of what number?
7.
7. Now, let's think about Shabbat for a second. Shabbat is on what day? The 7th day. Now, I'm going to tell you something. You'll have to check it afterwards in order to believe that I'm right. How many words are in the description of Shabbat? In the section in chapter 2. That's the end of the first creation story. There are 3 verses there that describe Shabbat. You know how many words there are? Don't count now because we don't have time. And you don't have to take my word for it. You can check it at home afterwards. There are 35 words in the description of Shabbat. What's the point here? Not only is the world created with order, purpose, design, even the language that's used to describe the creation follows a consistent pattern. This is a well thought out document, both in terms of the content and even the style in which it's presented in the words of the Torah, conveying that this is a very thought out, logical structure. Creation and the story of creation reflect order, purpose, design from beginning to end. But the God of chapter 2 is not like that at all. Now, let's move on. Unless you have any questions, let's move on. We said that chapter 2 is the story largely of the human being. Okay. What was the function of the human being in chapter 2? Remind me, we talked about this last week. According to chapter 2, what is the primary function of the human being?
To work the land.
To work the land, because if you look carefully in chapter 2, verse 7, or actually preceding verse 7, in verse 5, the Torah tells us that God created, that there was no plant growing. We talked about this last week. There was no plant growing, no vegetation on the earth. Why? Because there was no rain, and because there was no human being to cultivate. And what did God do right afterwards? He created the human being, which implies that the function of the human being is to work the earth. Okay? So it seems like the human being is like subservient, like is meant to work. His focus is the earth. Where is the earth found? We talked about this last week. Where is the earth found? Where is the earth found? To work the earth. Where do you need to go to work? Where does one need to go to fulfill your task? Terry, what were you saying? Right here, under my feet. Where does a human being need to go to fulfill his task according to chapter 1?
Everywhere.
Right. What?
Everywhere.
Everywhere, because his task, according to chapter 1, is to fill the earth. Fill the earth, the world. But we're to fill the earth, which means to spread your wings, to spread and proliferate across the earth. But if your function is la'avodat adama, to work the land presumably is right under your feet. Which begs the question that most people don't ask. And I'd like you to follow with me on the transition from verse 7 to verse 8. Chapter 2, verse 7 and verse 8. Let's read it together, and you tell me what's strange about these two verses. Let's read chapter 2, verse 7. I'll read it in Hebrew and then the English translation. Vayitzer Adonai Elohim et ha'adam afar min ha'adama, vayipach be'apav nishmat chayim, vahi adam lenefesh chaya. The Lord God formed man from the dust of the earth. He blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. We talked about that last week. That the human being, what makes him unique, is the fact that God blew the breath of life into him. Okay? Now we have a human being to work the earth. Where is the Adamah? We said it a moment ago. It's beneath your feet. But now let's read the next verse, and you'll tell me what's strange about it. Vayita Adonai Elohim gan be'edem mikedem, vayasem sham et ha'adam asher yatzal. The Lord God planted a garden in Eden in the east and placed there the man who he had formed. What's the problem?
He moved him to the east. He moved him somewhere.
He moved him. Why move him?
Yeah, I don't
Why
know.
move him from where he's presently located to some other garden, to some other place? So, in other words, if he's meant to work the earth, la'avod adama, adama is everywhere. It's everywhere. It's right now. It's right here where you are, under your feet. There's adama. So why does God feel a need to put him in this place called Gan Eden? That's the question. So in order to answer the question, we have to understand the nature of Gan Eden, and for that, I'd like to move forward. But so he puts him in this Gan Eden place. What's special about Gan Eden? Verse 9. Vayatzmach Adonai Elohim min ha'adama kol etz nechmad lema'eh v'tov lema'achal. And from the ground the Lord caused to grow every tree that was pleasing to the sight and good for food, with the tree of life in the middle of the garden, the tree of knowledge of good and bad. Let's put aside the tree of knowledge of good and bad. That's another discussion. So presumably, why did God put him in the Garden of Eden? Help me out here. Or let me rephrase the question. For whom? Who is the beneficiary of the Garden of Eden according to verse 9? Who's the beneficiary? Terry?
I guess the trees were planted for the humans.
Of course. Look at the language. The language is the cause to grow every tree that was pleasing to the sight and good for food. For whom? For the human being who God placed there. So the impression one gets from reading this verse is that God put him in the Garden of Eden to have a good life. And let's continue. It continues. I'm going to read English directly because of our time limits. A river issues from Eden to water the garden, and it then divides and becomes 4 branches. The name of the first, okay, then names the rivers. I want to go into the second. Okay, then they names the rivers. So what is this saying about river issues from Eden to water the garden? What is the sense? Like, what is your sense? What is this all about? What is the point of all this water? For what purpose?
For
For
life.
growth.
For growth, for life, for richness, for like you guys. When we talk about paradise, the Garden of Eden, in contemporary parlance, the Garden of Eden is the most beautiful place on earth. What does it mean? It's where we all want to go. We all want to go to paradise, the Garden of Eden, because our assumption is the Garden of Eden is the most beautiful, wonderful, lush, green water. When you go to places in the world with running water and greenery, you think this is the Garden of Eden. So the Garden of Eden is the greatest life experience you can imagine. That's in our minds. But the text backs it up, because the text is saying he created these trees that are good for the eyes and good for the palate. And then we have these rivers with abundance of water. So it sounds like God is putting him in the Garden of Eden for his pleasure. But now the text confuses us. Read verse 15. ויקח אדוני אלוהים את האדם ויניחהו בגן עדן לעובדה ולשומרה. The Lord God took the man and placed him in the Garden of Eden to till it and tend it. What's the problem here? What's the problem here?
Well, it sounds like it was already grown up.
But there's a greater problem. Forget the practical side of this.
It's not pleasure. I mean, he was put there supposedly for pleasure, but now he has to work. And
Make up your mind. Make up your mind. Is the garden for the sake of the man, or is the man for the sake of the garden? Now, most commentaries haven't picked up on the complexity, the tension within the text. They either say it's pleasure or they say it's work, but the text tells us both. Now, the words "le'ovda u'lishamra," to till it and to tend it, remind us of the words that were given before God put him in the garden, when it says to work the ground. But the thing is, what work needs to be done in the Garden of Eden? If the trees are growing and fruit is growing naturally, what work do you need to do?
You have to prune them.
Okay, that's a very good suggestion. You have to prune the trees. You
And
have to
pick them.
What? That's a lot
them.
of hard work. That's not a lot of hard work. Now,
Harvest.
the commentaries discuss this question, but it seems to me, and I'm not the only one to say this, that the kind of work that's meant to be performed in the Garden of Eden is not particularly difficult labor. It's not particularly difficult labor. In other words, yes, the Garden of Eden is for your benefit, but you have to put some effort. You have to put forth some effort for the garden to yield its fruit, for you to maximize that pleasure. And so you have here a sense that the Garden of Eden, is a place where, and I'm going to use this is my coinage, as a reciprocal relationship, right? In a sense that the man, the Adam, who was a creature of the Adamah, is put in a place where he's able to enable the ground to yield, the Adamah to yield its fruit without much difficulty. You have to put in some work, but not too much work. So the vision of the Garden of Eden is to be able to work the ground, which was the man function of the world, but in a place where your work yields wonderful results for you. In other words, there's meant to be a symbiotic relationship between the man and the land. So the vision, and why is the paradise so wonderful, right? It is wonderful, but it's not exclusively wonderful, because according to the text, you have to put in some work. Maybe not hard work, but you have to put in some effort for it to yield its fruit. Because God, in his vision, wanted the Adam and the Adamah, the man and the earth, to have this kind of symbiotic relationship where one brings out the best in the other. That was the vision. But there's one more thing that was part of this vision. After Adam and Eve's sin, if you look at chapter 3, verse 8, chapter 3, verse 8, after they already sinned, which we're not going to talk about now, וישמעו את קול אדוני אלוהים מתהלך בגן ברוח היום. What do they hear? The sound of the Lord moving about in the garden at the breezy time of day. And that's when God then confronts them about their sin. But what's important to me is, what is this business about God moving around in the garden? What does that teach us about the nature of the Garden of Eden? It's not just a place where the man and the woman can live in a peaceful, harmonious relationship with the ground. It's a place where they live in a harmonious relationship with whom else? God.
God.
God is somehow present in the Garden of Eden. So the reason, in the biblical sense, that the Garden of Eden is such a Garden of Eden, such a paradise, is because the man and the ground are meant to have this wonderful partnership, relationship. But it's not just them, it's also with God's presence. That was the vision. That's where God put him in order to fulfill his purpose in the world, where he can not just work, but he can be a recipient, a beneficiary of his own his own work. And all this in the locus of God's presence. This was the vision. But as we all know, that the vision was not realized, because very soon after, it's not clear how long, but very soon after, they were put in the Garden of Eden and told that there's one tree they cannot eat. They ate and they sinned. And that led to their banishment from this wonderful place. And so once they're out of this, they have to figure out how to get the land to yield its fruit. And it's going to be a far more difficult process, because you all know that we don't have time to show the punishment of Adam in particular was that from this point on, you're going to have to work really hard for the land to yield its fruit. Thorns and thistles, the ground will grow. It will not be as harmonious as it was meant to be. And so the story of chapter 2, the story of the second creation story, is really a story of God putting forth all his effort for the sake of the human being, a relationship God who cares about his creature, who tries to give him the best life, and when he's lonely, to find a solution. And they disappoint. And they have to face the consequences of their actions. So it's a God who tries desperately to create a good life for his human creation, only to be disappointed. The God of chapter 1 is not disappointed. The God of chapter 1 looks at his creation and says everything is perfect. The God of chapter 2, at the end of the day, which is also chapter 3, the J story of creation starts with high hopes and very lofty visions and ends with disappointment. And so with this, we need to conclude this section, because in our next 2 classes, we're going to be skipping from, and this is only because we only have 4 classes. If I had 20 classes, we can do the entire section, but we only have 4 classes. But what we did, we set up 2 creation stories which reflect two conceptions of God, 2 conceptions of the human being and the relationship between them, right? And now we're going to skip forward. We're even going to skip the Cain and Abel story, simply because we don't have enough time. And we're going to skip to chapter 6 in Genesis, which is the story of the flood. And what I'm going to try to show you is that there are 2 stories of the flood, just as there are 2 stories of creation, that reflect these same conceptions, but how they tell the story and what the deeper message is behind the story is a function of the worldviews through which they tell the stories. And that we're going to have to discuss in our coming lessons. Any questions before we conclude?
I wonder why Rashi didn't, think that the 2 things can coexist, or not coexist, but that they're both right.
Because I'll say this again, because there is thousands of years, because the idea of living with complexity, the idea that God can be multivocal and we can accept that God cannot contradict himself is not part of ancient or even medieval interpretation of the Bible. It just wasn't done from the rabbis onwards. If you ever studied the Talmud, whenever the rabbis encountered contradictions between texts, and they encountered them all the time, they always try to find a way to harmonize these texts. Again, and that is not to be taken lightly, because that starts with a certain theological assumption that until the 19th century, until the 20th century, until Rabbi Soloveitchik and Rabbi Mordechai Breuer came along, right, was the mainstream approach to contradictions within the Bible. Again, on the assumption that God has to be speaking in one consistent voice. So I'm happy, Terry, that I was able to convince you, right, that the Torah can be complex. God can speak about, and you were so convinced that you say, well, why didn't everybody else think of that before?
Right.
To us, it may seem obvious, but for people who lived 100 or 200, 500, 1,000, 1,500 years ago, that was a very bizarre notion. The idea that God can contradict himself. And we don't have to reconcile it. We can accept the contradictions. And that's part of what, I guess, why I felt the need to write a book. Because Rav Mordechai Breuer developed this, but I took it to, try to analyze the entire section of the first part of Genesis according to this theory, that there are consistent parallel stories, and they all make sense within their own worldviews. But no one has done this. Okay, that's, I guess, why I felt the need to write a book, to really develop this in a way that's in a coherent way. Any other questions? Joe, I'm sorry you joined us late. You missed out on the fun. Any other it's recorded, so you can watch it afterwards. Any other questions before we conclude?
Yeah, I was going to say that this class has been recorded and it will shortly be uploaded to the Shah's YouTube channel. Thank you so much, Rabbi Harbater. That was such a great class, and you took us off the precipice of waiting for an understanding of why we have this duality, and you gave us a great level of meaning. I can't wait to hear you do it again for the story of the flood.
Stories of the flood.
Stories of the flood. I just want to share a logistical note. We will resume next week back on Monday evening. Today was an exceptional night, moving the class to Tuesday because of yesterday's Canada-wide rally. So thank you for your attendance tonight. I hope this was meaningful. I hope you enjoyed. It's very challenging. This is an unusual class. We're not used to this type of in-depth, high-level Torah study. This is as high and as excellent as it gets. And we are so lucky to hear from Rabbi Harbater. This is very, very beautiful material, challenging. And God willing, we will continue next Monday at 12 noon Montreal time, 7 p.m.
See you then. Happy Hanukkah. Happy Hanukkah.
Happy Hanukkah. Happy